Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Last week we talked about Warlock Invocations, and this week we're also talking about Warlock Invocations. I've been doing a invocation by invocation analysis, and last week we talked about all the invocations that are available to Warlocks at levels 2 and 3, and this week we're going to talk about all the rest of the invocations. I'm going to start with the ones that are available at level 5, and I'm going to conclude with the ones that are available at level 15. Before we do that, I want to thank some of my Archmage level patrons. I have a Patreon. There is a link in the video description, and today I specifically want to call out Scott Ballantyne, Sean Bauer, TUM, Takusin, Thomas Barreiro, Geek Dice, Jay Gemmel, Joseph Robideau, and Michael Troy. Thank you all so much for your support, and thank you to all my patrons. Let's get started. As usual, as I evaluate these invocations, I will be color coding them for the effectiveness I think they have. I will be putting them as red if it's an invocation I would never take. I'll put them as orange if I think it's an invocation that could occasionally be useful, but is probably too circumstantial. I'll rate it as purple if I think it is a decent invocation. I will rank it as green if I think it's a good invocation, and I'll rank it as blue if I think it is a must-have invocation. Now, if you are colorblind, I will be using stars with each ranking as well. 1 star for red, 2 stars for orange, 3 stars for purple, 4 stars for green, and 5 stars for blue. That brings us into the invocations that become available at level 5. The first one we're going to talk about is Cloak of Flies. Now, what Cloak of Flies does is it is a bonus action to use, and it allows us to surround ourselves with an aura. And that aura is 5 feet in every direction, though it doesn't go through cover, and it lasts as long as we want, until we're incapacitated or we dismiss it as a bonus action. And it does 2 things for us. The first is it's going to give us advantage on charisma intimidation checks. There is a distinct possibility that as a warlock you might be the best at intimidation already in the party, so getting advantage on that could be very useful when you need intimidation checks. The second is any creature that starts its turn within the aura takes poison damage equal to your charisma modifier. So we're talking 3 points of damage, probably eventually 5 points of damage. And there's no save for that damage. One of the problems with that is that it is also going to affect friendly creatures. This could be an issue because it is going to affect how your party can interact with each other. Somebody wants to grant you with a touch spell, they would need to go into that aura in order to do so. The next thing is it grants disadvantage on any charisma check that is not intimidation. So our persuasion checks, our deception checks, these are going to be made with disadvantage if we have Cloak of Flies. And although we can dismiss Cloak of Flies when we don't want it anymore, we can't use it again until we complete a rest. So if this could just be something you turn on and off whenever you want it, I could find it being more useful, but as it is, I think that's a pretty limiting factor, considering there are a lot of times where you definitely do not want your Cloak of Flies active. So therefore, I think this becomes somewhat circumstantial. And remember, of course, that poison damage too is often dealing with immunity, so it's not a reliable source of damage. Charisma intimidation checks are going to come up sometimes, but they're not necessarily going to come up every adventure. So this is a circumstantial ability, and I'm giving it an orange rating. The next invocation I'm going to talk about is Eldritch Smite. This is an ability only available to Pact of the Blade. And what this does is, once on our turn when we hit a creature with a Pact weapon, we can expend a Warlock slot in order to deal an extra 1d8 force damage to the target, plus another 1d8 per level of the spell slot. And we can knock a target prone if it's huge or smaller. On the surface, this sounds a lot like a Paladin Smite ability, but there are some important differences. So the first difference is how the damage is calculated. To a large degree, it's the same. If you're using a 3rd level slot, you're going to do an extra 48 damage with either a regular smite or an Eldritch Smite. 2 ways it's different is, first off, if you are targeting undead or fiends with a Divine Smite, you're going to get an extra d8. With an Eldritch Smite, you won't. The other difference is because Eldritch Smites are based off pack slots, and pack slots eventually are going to max out at 5th level, eventually Eldritch Smites will do 68 points of damage on a hit, and with Divine Smites you can never use more than a 4th level slot. Now there are two ways that I think are pretty important that Eldritch Smite is just better than Divine Smite. The first is that we can do this with a ranged weapon. We're not forced with melee weapons, which means that if we are using a bow-using character, we could potentially Eldritch Smite with their bow attacks. The second thing is the potential to knock enemies prone. This is automatic. There's no save as long as they are huge or smaller, which most creatures are. So if I am using weapons and I am Pact of the Blade, Eldritch Smite is probably something I want on my list, especially if I'm going to roll a crit. That's so much more damage that we're going to get if we put an Eldritch Smite on there. But remember, packed slots are incredibly limited, so spending even one pack slot on an Eldritch Smite is a huge investment, and it's not something to be done lightly. But I do think if using weapons is what you want to do, and doing damage is what you want to do, Eldritch Smite is probably something you want on your list. Therefore, I think it is a green rated invocation, and if I am playing a weapon-using Pact of the Blade Warlock that focuses on doing damage, Eldritch Smite is probably something I want, even though I'm going to use it sparingly. The next invocation available at 5th level is Gift of the Depths. This allows us to breathe underwater, and we gain a swimming speed equal to our walking speed. We can also cast water breathing once without expending a spell slot, and we can do so again after we complete a long rest. Now, the limitation of only being able to cast water breathing once is probably not an issue, because that is a 24-hour spell that can affect the whole party. So you cast water breathing once at the beginning of the day, and everybody has water breathing for the entire day. And then the next day you can do it again. And that sounds really good, except remember that water breathing is a ritual spell. This means there is a significant possibility, right at 5th level, that we could have another party member who can cast water breathing for free at the beginning of every day anyways. And being able to breathe underwater isn't very useful when you can already breathe underwater. So this ability could become redundant. Now the swimming speed might be useful, but again, this is very circumstantial. In most sessions, swimming speed will never come up. There is another way I think this could be very useful. If you are underwater and breathing water and you're hit with something like a Dispel Magic, that could be devastating if you are using the water breathing spell. With Gift of the Depths, you are protected from that. So if I was going to be playing in a campaign where I expected a huge portion of it to happen underwater, I could definitely see Gift of the Depths being useful. But that's about it. In most campaigns, I probably wouldn't even consider this, and I'm going to rank it orange for that reason. The next invocation I want to talk about is Maddening Hex. This requires we have either the Hex spell and or a Warlock feature that curses, which is right now limited to Hexblade Curse or Sign of Ill Omen. And what we do is when a creature is already cursed by one of those features, as a bonus action we can do psychic damage to them equal to our charisma modifier. It also does psychic damage to any creature of our choice that we can see within 5 feet of it. So there's no friendly fire on this. So we're getting some extra damage on those features, and that extra damage has a small area of effect that does not include friendly fire. All those things are pretty good, but there are some problems with this. The first is that it is only activated by creatures that are affected by a Hex spell or one of those Warlock features. Sign of Ill Omen is a difficult feature to use and not an invocation I'm likely to take. That leaves us with Hexblade Curse and Hex. Both of those require a bonus action to place in the first place. So on the turn where we place a Hexblade Curse or a Hex spell, we can't use Maddening Hex. We have to wait until the following turn. And what I find often is I'll hex a creature, and on the next turn that creature has been dispatched, and now I need to place it on a different creature. In all those cases, I wouldn't be able to use Maddening Hex at all. And with a lot of Warlocks, I'm not necessarily using Hex all the time, so I can't be using Maddening Hex unless I'm using either Hex or Hexblade Curse. So there are some pretty limiting factors here, but there are some good things here too. Number one, there's no save for the damage. Number two, the damage is psychic, and psychic is a very reliable kind of damage. And number three, it does give us the ability to potentially damage other creatures, and that is pretty useful when we're talking about a type of character that is usually focused on single target damage. And again, if I'm really focusing on my Eldritch Blast, I'm probably using Hex a reasonable amount of the time. And if I'm fighting a very powerful creature, it might be hexed for several turns, in which case I could get a lot of use out of Maddening Hex. So overall, I think it's okay. I don't think it's a great invocation. A lot of Warlocks might find it frustrating, but I think it could be useful enough that I'm going to rank it purple. The next invocation I want to talk about is Mire the Mind. This allows us to cast Slow once using a Warlock spell slot. Now, Slow would be a reasonably useful addition to the Warlock spell list, because although we have Fear, although we have Hypnotic Pattern, there are creatures that are immune to those things. They also both have Friendly Fire. Slow is nice in that it doesn't have those issues, even though the effect of it is not as dramatic. But this has the same problems as many of the invocations have that are once per long rest, in that we're using up our pack slots. That's difficult. We can only do this once per long rest. That's difficult. And the number of times where we need Slow, where Fear is not good enough, where Hypnotic Pattern is not good enough, are going to come up once in a while, but it's not coming up enough to make this worthwhile, in my opinion, so I'm going to give this an orange ranking. The next invocation is One with Shadows. So what this does is when you are in an area of dim light or darkness, so if you're in bright light, it doesn't work, we can use our action to become invisible until we move or take an action or a reaction. So there are some problems here. Now, using our action, first off, makes it something we probably don't want to do in combat. But even outside of combat, I think the uses of this are pretty circumstantial. Although, technically speaking, it gives us an indefinite form of invisibility, it is immediately gone once we move, take an action, or a reaction. So this pretty much prevents us from doing anything while we're using One with Shadows. And that is a big problem. Potentially we could go into a room, we could hide using our One with Shadows, and then we could stay hidden for a long, long time, observing what occurs, for example. But that's pretty much it. Even the invisibility spell allows us to move. This one does not. And that's a pretty big problem. And I do think that makes this overly circumstantial, so I'm going to give it an orange rating. The next invocation is Sign of Ill Omen. This allows us to cast Bestow Curse once using a Warlock spell slot. We can't do so again until we finish a long rest. So this is the same problem where we're talking about casting a spell that is going to use our valuable pack slots, and it can only be done once per long rest. So is Bestow Curse that great? And the answer is, it's not that great. In fact, when we cast Bestow Curse as a 3rd level spell, I'd say it's a poor spell. Now, the one advantage I'll give this, and the one reason I'm not going to rank this red, is because once we are 9th level, we can cast Bestow Curse, and because we're automatically casting it with a 5th level slot, then we are getting the advantage where it's not using our concentration, because that's what happens when you upcast Bestow Curse with a 5th level slot. And so that's okay in certain circumstance, so that's probably good enough for me to give this an orange rating, but that's at most. In the vast majority of Warlock builds, I'm not even considering this. The next invocation is Thirsting Blade. This is only for Pact of the Blade, and if I'm taking Pact of the Blade, I'm probably taking Thirsting Blade. This essentially is extra attack. We can attack with our packed weapon twice instead of once whenever we take the attack action on our turn. So it works very much like the 5th level ability that most martial classes get. And if attacking with a weapon is what I'm doing, then I probably want the extra attack feature, and it's probably worth an invocation for me to take it. Now we could potentially ignore this and go with Booming Blade or Green Flame Blade and focus on the extra damage we get from that, but I think in most cases we're going to get more out of getting that extra attack. So Thirsting Blade I really think is worth it, especially when we're talking about adding things like Hex. We want to get as many attacks as we can. So for a Pact of the Blade character that's using a weapon, I do think Thirsting Blade is probably something you want to take, and I'm giving it a green ranking. The next invocation is Tomb of Levistus, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it is spelled Levistus. Maybe it's Levistus, I'm not sure. One thing I like about this invocation is it is very unique. As a reaction, when we take damage, we can entomb ourselves in ice, which melts away at the end of our next turn. We gain 10 temporary hit points per Warlock level. That is a ton of temporary hit points. And they take as much of the triggering damage as possible. This might completely negate that attack. Immediately after we take the damage, we gain vulnerability to fire damage. Our speed is reduced to 0, and we are incapacitated. These effects, including any remaining temporary hit points, all end when the ice melts. Once we use this invocation, we can't use it again until we finish a short or long rest. So like I said, I like the fact that this is an incredibly unique ability. There's really no spell or no other class feature that does anything quite like this. But there are some significant limiting factors. And the most significant is we're going to basically give up our next turn. And that doesn't matter even if the attack goes through the Tomb of Levistus and hits our regular temporary hit points, although that ice has been effectively destroyed. The ability specifically says the vulnerability to fire damage, the reduction of speed to 0, and the incapacitated condition are going to last until the end of our next turn. And those are some pretty significant disadvantages to be having. But I'll say this, if you're going to get hit with an ability that is going to do so much damage, it's going to take you down to 0 hit points, you're probably going to be giving up your next turn anyways. And even if you get revived, you're probably getting revived with not a lot of hit points. So there are definitely cases where I could see Tomb of Levistus being very, very good. So I'm going to give it a purple ranking, though there are certainly arguments you could make for it being orange. It really depends on how often this is going to come up, and it's hard to say exactly how often it's going to come up. It's probably going to depend on your campaign. But if it can prevent you from falling to 0 hit points, I would be using this, and I would think it would be pretty good in those cases. The next invocation is Bewitching Whispers. We're now into invocations that we can only access at 7th level. This allows us to cast Compulsion once using a Warlock spell slot, which we can't do again until our next long rest. So, same problem where we're adding one spell, we can only cast it once per long rest. It's using our pack slot, and Compulsion's not that great a spell. So this is not a good invocation, not one I'm even going to look at. It is a red-ranked invocation. Speaking of red-ranked invocations, the next one is Dreadful Word. This allows us to cast Confusion once using a Warlock spell slot that we can't do again until our next long rest. Same problems as the last one. And the same issue where the spell isn't that great and it isn't adding that much to our character. So it is again almost throwing your invocation away, and I'm giving it a red ranking. The next ability is Ghostly Gaze. This allows us to, as an action, see through solid objects to a range of 30 feet. And within that range we have Dark Vision if we don't already have it, and this lasts for 1 minute or until our concentration ends. So we can't do this at the same time while we're, say, maintaining a Hex spell. And we can only do this once per short rest. That said, the ability to see through solid objects is pretty darn good. This might be knowing what's on the other side of that imposing door. This could give us a chance to see enemies before they ever have a chance to see us or even know we're nearby. It might even just let us know how thick a wall is. There's a lot of ways I could see this being useful. And although it's not usable very often, it's good enough that I think it's worthy of a purple ranking. It's definitely something I would think about with a Warlock build. The next invocation is Relentless Hex. This again requires the Hex spell or a Warlock feature that curses. Same thing, we're talking about either Hexblade Curse or Sign of Ill Omen. And once a creature is hexed, or has those other curse features applied, we can use our bonus action to magically teleport up to 30 feet to an unoccupied space we can see within 5 feet of the target cursed by our hex spell or a Warlock feature such as Hexblade Curse or Sign of Ill Omen. And we must be able to see the cursed target in order to do this. So the first glaring problem of this is that in most cases, the last thing our Warlock wants to do is move within 5 feet of the creature they have hexed. Because if we are using an Eldritch Blast Warlock, range is our friend. We don't want to get rid of that range. The second issue with this is, of course, that it's requiring our bonus action. And as I talked about before, when we are talking about using Hex and we're talking about using Hexblade Curse, we're using our bonus action. So this means that we can't do it on the same turn that we apply those features. Now it has the advantage that it's not going to use our pack slot. And that could be really, really good because pack slots are so limited. And I'm not necessarily going to be keeping Misty Step on my Warlock spell list. But I gotta say, the times where I could see this being overly useful are few and far between. I certainly couldn't see this on any Warlock that isn't going to be a melee Warlock. If I am a ranged Warlock, firing Eldritch Blast from a distance, the last thing I want to do is get closer to my enemy. So I'm never going to use Relentless Hex, unless there's something even more important to get away from. But what if I'm a Pact of the Blade Warlock, and maybe I do focus on melee, and maybe Relentless Hex is the way I can get close to that creature I want to get close to? Okay, so there are certain circumstances I could see this being helpful. Not enough for me to give it a good ranking, but I will give it an orange ranking rather than red. The next invocation I'm going to talk about is Sculptor of Flesh. This allows us to cast Polymorph once using a Warlock spell slot. We can't do so again until we finish a long rest. So this suffers many of the same problems of the invocations I talked about earlier, where it's using our pack slot, and we can only use it once per long rest. But Sculptor of Flesh is a little different in that Polymorph, especially when you were 7th level, is really, really good. In fact, it is potentially the best 4th level spell in the game. It's certainly in the running when you are that level. It's not something I'm necessarily going to be casting much after a few more levels have passed, but at 7th level, it's extremely good. And remember, we can switch out invocations, so this is something I would definitely consider at 7th level, despite the fact that I can only do it once per day, and despite the fact it uses a pack slot. Though it is definitely something that I probably wouldn't keep as my Warlock continues to level up. But still, as a 7th level pick, I think it's not a bad pick, despite the disadvantages, so I'm going to give it a purple ranking. The next invocation is Trickster's Escape. This allows us to cast Freedom of Movement once on ourselves without expending a spell slot. And we regain the ability to do so when we finish a long rest. So the first thing to note here is this does not use our pack slot to cast, and although it can only be cast once per day, that ability to cast it without using a pack slot is a significant advantage. The issue is Freedom of Movement is not a spell that is going to come up a huge amount of the time, though when it does come up, it's really, really important. And the other thing I'll mention about this is that because Freedom of Movement has a 1 hour duration, and because Freedom of Movement does not require concentration, this is absolutely a spell that I'll probably be casting every day, even if I'm casting it as a buff. And even if it doesn't come up in combat, it will just be another layer of ways that my character is a little better than they otherwise would be. Whether they get hit by a web, or a creature that restrains, or all those many other things that can affect your movement or cause the grappled or restrained condition, Freedom of Movement could be extremely useful in those cases. And therefore, I think this is a decent selection, and I'm going to give it a purple ranking. Now we're into the invocations that are available at 9th level or higher. And the first one I want to talk about is Ascendant Step. This allows us to cast Levitate on ourselves at will without expending a spell slot or material component. So right away, we've got a spell that we can cast at will. There's no limitation per day. We're not using our pack slots, so that's good. Levitate is a 2nd level spell, and it's a good 2nd level spell, so that's good. The disadvantage here is we can only cast Levitate on ourselves. Levitate, one of the nice things about it is we could cast it on ourselves, we could cast it on an ally, we could cast it on an enemy. And we are taking those options and reducing them by 2/3. So I do think this is still not a bad ability, but it is not nearly as good as having the actual Levitate spell, though I love the fact that you can do it at will, so I'm going to give it a purple ranking. The next one is Minions of Chaos. This allows us to cast Conjure Elemental once using a Warlock spell slot. And again, we can't do so again until we finish a long rest. So, once again, we're talking about a spell that's basically added to our spell list. It's going to use our pack slots as normal, except we can only cast it once per day. So, how good is Conjure Elemental? I think on a Warlock, Conjure Elemental is actually really good. And the reason is because if we look at the 5th level spells for Warlock, the kind of standout spell there is Synaptic Static. Conjure Elemental is going to be good in a very different kind of combat than Synaptic Static is going to be good at. So it gives us something else we can do with a 5th level spell that's going to be useful in a different way. And I do think that adds something to Warlock. Conjure Elemental is not going to be a spell that comes into your playbook that you're often not going to cast. You're going to cast it. And you're going to use your pack slot, and that sucks, and you can only do it once per day, and that sucks, but you're still going to cast it, you're still going to get use out of it, so I'm going to give it a purple ranking overall. The next invocation is Otherworldly Leap. This allows us to cast Jump on ourselves at will without expending a spell slot or material component. Jump is a 1st level spell. I'm sorry, but 9th level is pretty late to be getting that at will. We could cast some 1st level spells at will with 2nd level invocations. Being able to cast a spell, and Jump isn't that great. Jump has occasional circumstantial uses. I think often it gets laughed at, but I don't think it's as bad as some people think. But on its own, it's an orange ranked spell. So this is definitely an orange ranked invocation, even though you can do it at will. And remember, again, this is limited to only yourself. Jump you can normally cast on others. The next invocation is Whispers of the Grave. This allows us to cast Speak with Dead at will without expending a spell slot. And again, nice to be able to cast spells at will without expending spell slots. Speak with Dead, at least it's not a 1st level spell, but it is an incredibly circumstantial spell. And so therefore, I can't give this more than an orange ranking, because although you can cast it at will, I don't think you're going to cast it most of the time. I think sessions will go by where you don't cast it at all. Though I think it's an okay invocation because once in a while it's going to come up, and when it does, it could be very useful to be able to cast it over and over again. You might have a room full with dead bodies. So I do think enough of the time it is going to be very useful to give it an orange ranking. That brings us into our 12th level invocations, and there is only one. There's only one invocation that's limited to 12th level, and that's Lifedrinker, which requires Pact of the Blade. If we're taking Pact of the Blade, I think this is pretty much a no-brainer. When you hit a creature with your Pact weapon, the creature takes extra necrotic damage equal to your Charisma modifier, minimum 1. This means, let's say you're playing a Hexblade, and we've got Thirsting Blades, we've got our extra attack, we're attacking twice, being able to add our Charisma bonus to not only our initial damage, but then again as necrotic damage, and it does stack. When we're talking about Hex Weapon, that is adding to our base weapon damage. And when we are talking about Lifedrinker, we're adding necrotic damage. These are coming from different sources. So yes, you get to add your Charisma bonus twice to the attacks. And even if you're not playing a Hexblade, if you're playing Pact of the Blade, and you're making the best you can as a non-Hexblade with Pact of the Blade, Lifedrinker, again, it's just something you have to have. Adding your Charisma bonus to every weapon attack damage, that's something you just want to have. Now we're into the highest level invocations. These ones are not available till you are 15th level. And the first one is Chains of Carceri. This allows us to cast Hold Monster at will. If it stopped right there, this would be blue. Being able to cast Hold Monster at will would be fantastic. Hold Monster is a reasonably high level spell, and a pretty effective spell if you land it. It's not a spell that I generally recommend for regular casters because expending a spell slot and an action on something that may or may not work is not going to be worth it. But if you can cast it at will, I would definitely be trying it, right? Because then we're giving up our action, but at least we're not giving up that spell slot. So if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. But if we read the rest of the invocation, this isn't that good, because we can cast Hold Monster at will targeting a celestial, fiend, or elemental without expending a spell slot or material components. So it doesn't work on anything except for celestials, fiends, and elementals. And there is also the limitation that we must finish a long rest before we can use this invocation on the same creature again. That's not the end of the world. If we're in a regular combat, there's usually multiple creatures, and then when we get to the next combat, we're going to have different creatures again. So that's not the end of the world. It's a little bit limiting, but the celestial, fiend, or elemental limitation is huge. Unless we're actually like going through the abyss, or we're going through the 9 hells or something like that, we're not going to be able to use Chains of Carceri in most combats, and that makes this automatically an orange ranking for me. The next one is Master of Myriad Forms. This allows you to cast Alter Self at will without expending a spell slot. Now, Alter Self is a 2nd level spell. It's not a great 2nd level spell. It allows us to disguise ourselves, which if we have, by the way, a 2nd level invocation, Mask of 1,000 Faces, we can do at will without using our concentration. This one does use our concentration, so even when you're masking yourself, I'd say it's not as good as that 2nd level invocation. And it also allows you to do things like breathe water and get a swim speed. Again, breathing water is something we can do with a 3rd level ritual, or perhaps another invocation, as is getting a swim speed, or get a crappy natural attack, which we're never going to be using at 15th level anymore. So ultimately, I don't think this is good, because it's not as good as Mask of 1,000 Faces at disguising ourselves, and the other uses of it are either going to probably be redundant or useless. So this is a red ranking. I don't think you should take this one. The next one is Shroud of Shadow. This allows us to cast invisibility at will without expending a spell slot. It is the invisibility spell. We can do it in bright light, we can move, we can take actions, but we do have the limitations of the invisibility spell, and those are significant. Invisibility is generally not something you're going to get a lot of use in combat unless you're running away, but there are utility uses for it. But invisibility is a 2nd level spell. We're talking about 15th level to cast it at will. This is coming on really late for a spell that has circumstantial use, and probably very circumstantial by 15th level. I wouldn't be relying on invisibility to be reliable at 15th level, because a lot of creatures at this point are going to have blind sight or true sight, and so you just can't count on it either. Still, there's enough utility there. I'll give this an orange ranking, but this one is on the borderline. The next invocation, however, Visions of Distant Realms, is fantastic. We can cast Arcane Eye at will without expending a spell slot. Arcane Eye is a 4th level spell, and it's one of the better 4th level spells in the game. And it is definitely a spell I would still be considering to cast at 15th level. And being able to cast it at will is something that I would definitely get use out of, because even at 15th level, 4th level slots are not infinite. And so being able to cast Arcane Eye is still something that is using up a resource that is valuable. And being able to do it at will is something I'd be doing all the time. So I do think this is a pretty good invocation, and I'm giving it a green ranking. And that brings us to our final invocation, Witch Sight. This one allows us to see the true form of any shape changer or creature concealed by illusion or transmutation magic while the creature is within 30 feet of you and within line of sight. So this isn't even remotely as good as something like True Sight. We are only talking about being able to discern shape changers or creatures concealed by illusion or transmutation magic, and we're talking about a limit of 30 feet. That's not very much. If this was True Sight all the time, this would probably be blue. But this isn't remotely True Sight all the time, and in a lot of cases this isn't going to come up at all, so I gotta give this orange. So that's a lot of invocations, but that's every invocation currently available to Warlocks, and where I would rank them compared to each other. As we go into following weeks, I'm going to be talking about Warlock spells, and then we're going to be talking about some Warlock builds. We're also going to be talking about the ways that Warlock can be multi-classed, because the 1 or 2 level dips we see all the time, I think just scratches at the surface of what we can do with a Warlock. So I hope to see you in the future weeks as we talk more about Warlocks. Until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone. Talk to you next week.